Before you begin, write in the comments which city and country you're watching us from. This channel exists to record stories that should never have been forgotten. In February 1862, a physician in rural Virginia received a letter from a plantation overseer requesting an urgent consultation. The letter described a situation the overseer called medically impossible and potentially dangerous. An enslaved girl, blind since birth, had somehow learned to read. Not just simple words, but complex texts. She could identify books by touch, distinguish different editions of the Bible, and recite passages she claimed to be reading with her fingers. The overseer wanted the doctor to examine her, to explain how this was possible, and to determine whether she posed a threat to the plantation's order. The doctor arrived 3 days later. His report, discovered in a medical college archive in 1958, described what he witnessed as the most confounding case of my career, a phenomenon that defies both medical understanding and social possibility. The girl's name was never recorded in official documents. She was referred to only as the blind girl, or number 14, but in the months that followed, her abilities would be documented by multiple witnesses, debated by educated men, and ultimately suppressed with such thoroughness that her story vanished for nearly a century. What you're about to hear is reconstructed from medical records, plantation journals, church archives, and testimony that was sealed to prevent unrest and false hope among the colored population. This is not a miracle story. This is what they tried to bury. The plantation was called Riverside, located along the James River in Henrico County, Virginia, about 15 miles from Richmond. In 1862, Virginia was the heart of the Confederacy, and Richmond served as its capital. The war had been raging for nearly a year, and the plantation system, though under strain, remained intact. Riverside was a mid-sized tobacco plantation, owned by a family named Cunningham, worked by approximately 60 enslaved people. The girl was born there in the winter of 1848. Her mother, an enslaved woman named Hannah, had assisted with births on the plantation and immediately recognized that something was wrong with her daughter's eyes. The infant did not respond to light. Her pupils did not dilate or contract. By the time she was 6 months old, it was clear that she was completely blind. This was documented in the plantation's record book, where births, deaths, and medical conditions were logged for inventory purposes. The entry reads, Hannah's girl child, born January 1848, eyes defective, no vision, unlikely to be of labor value. Enslaved children with disabilities faced particularly brutal circumstances. They were seen as economic liabilities, unable to work, requiring care, consuming resources without producing value. Many did not survive childhood, but this girl survived, perhaps because her mother was skilled and valued, perhaps because she was simply resilient, or perhaps because the Cunningham family, while upholding slavery, were not deliberately cruel in the casual way some plantation owners were. The girl, let us call her by a name that appears in later documents, though it may not have been her real name, Mary, grew up in the slave quarters, navigating her world through sound, touch, and smell. She learned the plantation's geography by walking it repeatedly, memorizing distances and landmarks through her feet and hands. She learned to distinguish people by their voices and footsteps. She developed, as many blind people do, compensatory abilities that seemed almost supernatural to those around her. But what made Mary extraordinary was not just her adaptation to blindness. It was what happened when she was approximately 10 years old, in 1858. According to the diary of Rebecca Cunningham, the plantation owner's wife, Mary began exhibiting unusual behavior. She would sit for hours, running her fingers over books that had been left in the main house. When asked what she was doing, she said she was reading. The household staff thought she was playing pretend, mimicking what she had seen others do. But then Mary began to accurately describe the contents of the books she touched. Rebecca Cunningham, intrigued and somewhat unsettled, decided to test Mary. She gave her a Bible, a book Mary had never encountered before, and asked her what it said. According to Rebecca's diary entry from June 1858, Mary ran her fingers across the page in a systematic pattern, then said, "This is the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." She continued reciting the Beatitudes accurately without error. Rebecca was shocked. She asked Mary how she knew this. Mary explained that she could feel the letters. Each letter had a different shape, a different texture, and she had learned to recognize them. She said she had been practicing for 2 years, running her fingers over books in secret, teaching herself the patterns. This explanation seemed impossible. The books in the Cunningham household were printed with standard ink on standard paper. They had no raised letters, no special tactile features. To the touch, the pages should have felt smooth and uniform. Yet Mary insisted she could feel differences, subtle variations in the ink, slight depressions where the type had pressed into the paper, textures invisible to most people, but perceptible to her. Rebecca Cunningham consulted her husband, James Cunningham. He was skeptical. He believed Mary had somehow memorized Bible passages from hearing them read aloud at church services. Enslaved people at Riverside were required to attend Sunday services where scripture was read. To test this theory, James brought books from his study that had never been read aloud, books on agriculture, law, and natural history. He gave them to Mary and asked her to read. She could, slowly, haltingly, but accurately. She ran her fingers across the pages, pausing occasionally to work out unfamiliar words, but she read. She read about tobacco cultivation. She read about property law. She read about the classification of plants. And with each successful reading, the impossibility of her ability became more undeniable. Before we continue, leave a comment. Have you ever witnessed something that shouldn't be possible but was? James Cunningham documented these tests in his personal journal, entries that were preserved by his descendants and eventually donated to the Virginia Historical Society in 1932. In an entry from July 1858, he wrote, "I do not understand what I am witnessing. The blind girl reads books by touch, though the books have no special markings. I have consulted medical texts and can find no explanation for this ability. Some have claimed that blind individuals develop heightened senses, but this seems to exceed any documented case. I am both fascinated and disturbed. If word of this spreads, it will create complications." The complications James feared were multiple. First, there was the practical concern. Mary's ability challenged assumptions about what enslaved people, and particularly disabled enslaved people, were capable of. If a blind girl could teach herself to read, what did that say about claims that enslaved people were inherently inferior and incapable of education? Second, there was the legal concern. Virginia law prohibited teaching enslaved people to read and write. While Mary had apparently taught herself, the mere fact of her literacy could be seen as threatening. Literate enslaved people could forge passes, read abolitionist literature, organize resistance. And third, there was the metaphysical concern. How Mary accomplished this reading seemed to defy natural law, suggesting either a medical phenomenon beyond current understanding or something even more unsettling. James Cunningham decided to keep Mary's ability secret. He forbade his wife from discussing it with neighbors. He instructed the household staff not to mention it, and he restricted Mary's access to books, moving them to locked cabinets where she could not reach them. But by then, knowledge of Mary's abilities had already begun to spread among the enslaved community at Riverside. According to testimony collected decades later, in the 1930s, as part of the Federal Writers Project interviews with formerly enslaved people, Mary's ability was seen by other enslaved individuals as evidence of divine favor or ancestral wisdom. An elderly man named Joseph, who had been enslaved at Riverside as a child, recalled in his 1936 interview, "We all knew about Mary. She could read without eyes. Some folks said she had the sight, not in her eyes, but in her spirit. Others said the ancestors were guiding her hands. Whatever it was, it gave people hope. If Mary could do the impossible, maybe we could too." This hope was precisely what the Cunningham family feared. Enslaved people finding inspiration in Mary's abilities could lead to resistance, to attempts at self-education, to questioning of the social order. And so, the family attempted to isolate Mary. She was moved from the main house to a cabin at the edge of the plantation, away from the other enslaved workers. She was forbidden from attending church services. She was given tasks that kept her occupied and away from books, shelling peas, carding wool, work that could be done by touch and required no literacy. But isolation could not suppress what Mary represented. The story of the blind girl who could read continued to circulate, spreading beyond Riverside to neighboring plantations. In the tight-knit community of enslaved people, connected through marriages, shared work, and clandestine gatherings, news traveled despite white efforts to control information. By 1860, Mary had become something of a legend, a symbol of hidden potential and impossible achievement. This is when the story took a darker turn. In October 1860, a Methodist minister named Reverend Thomas Whitfield visited Riverside to conduct a revival meeting. He had heard rumors about Mary and requested to meet her. James Cunningham reluctantly agreed, hoping that a man of God could provide a religious explanation for Mary's abilities that would satisfy curiosity without raising dangerous questions. Reverend Whitfield's account of his encounter with Mary, preserved in a letter to a fellow minister and discovered in a church archive in Tennessee in 1974, described an experience that left him deeply shaken. He brought a Bible and asked Mary to read from it. She did accurately. He then brought a Greek New Testament, a text used by scholars and ministers, but completely inaccessible to most laypeople. He asked Mary if she could read Greek. She said she didn't know Greek, but she could tell him what the letters were, and she did. She ran her fingers across the Greek text and identified individual letters, alpha, beta, gamma, delta, with remarkable accuracy. She couldn't translate the text, but she could recognize the characters, which meant she was perceiving not just the English alphabet, but different writing systems entirely. Reverend Whitfield wrote, "I have witnessed something I cannot explain through any theology I know. This girl, blind and enslaved, possesses an ability that seems to transcend the natural order. She reads by touch what should be invisible to touch. She perceives what should be imperceptible. I'm forced to consider possibilities that unsettle me. Either this is a medical phenomenon science has not yet understood, or we are witnessing something that challenges our understanding of how God bestows gifts upon his creation. What disturbs me most is not her ability itself, but what it implies that this girl, deemed worthless by society, may possess capabilities that exceed those of educated men like myself." Reverend Whitfield's letter concluded with a warning. "I advise that Mary be watched carefully. Not because she poses any danger herself, but because what she represents, the possibility that our assumptions about race and capacity are false, could inspire unrest if widely known. In these troubled times, with abolitionists spreading their doctrines and tensions rising, we cannot afford such disruptions." The troubled times Reverend Whitfield referred to were the months leading up to the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln had been elected president in November 1860. Southern states were beginning to secede. Virginia had not yet seceded but was deeply divided. In this atmosphere of political crisis, anything that challenged the justifications for slavery became not just controversial but potentially dangerous. In April 1861, Virginia seceded and joined the Confederacy. The war began, and the Cunningham plantation, like all plantations in Virginia, was affected by the conflict. Men were conscripted, resources became scarce. The enslaved population, sensing the instability, became more restive. There were rumors of escape attempts, of enslaved people fleeing to Union lines, of potential uprisings. In this context, James Cunningham decided that Mary had become too great a liability. In August 1861, he wrote to Dr. Samuel Hayes, a physician in Richmond who specialized in disorders of the mind and unusual nervous conditions. The letter, found in Dr. Hayes's papers at the Medical College of Virginia, described Mary's abilities and asked whether they indicated mental illness or some other treatable condition. James wrote, "I am concerned that this girl's presence and the stories about her are creating instability among my people. I need a medical explanation that will dispel the superstitions and allow me to manage her appropriately." Dr. Hayes arrived at Riverside in September 1861. His examination of Mary, documented in a report he submitted to James Cunningham, was extensive. He tested her vision thoroughly and confirmed complete blindness. He examined her fingers and hands, looking for any physical abnormalities that might explain her heightened tactile sensitivity. He found none. Her hands were those of a normal 13-year-old girl, perhaps slightly more calloused from work, but otherwise unremarkable. He then conducted reading tests. He brought multiple books, newspapers, and documents. He blindfolded Mary, though she was already blind, to ensure no possibility of visual cues. He had her read passages selected at random. She read them all, with varying degrees of speed and accuracy, but consistently enough to prove that she was indeed reading by touch. Dr. Hayes's conclusion, as documented in his report, was both cautious and revealing. He wrote, "I can confirm that this girl possesses an extraordinary tactile sensitivity that allows her to perceive variations in printed text that would be imperceptible to most individuals. The mechanism by which this is possible remains unclear. It may be that the pressure of printing type creates microscopic depressions in paper that her fingers can detect. It may be that ink creates subtle texture differences. Or it may be that her brain has developed neural pathways that allow for tactile discrimination at a level we do not yet understand. What is clear is that this ability is real, not imagined or fraudulent. As to whether it constitutes a medical condition, I see no evidence of disease or mental disorder. This girl is simply extraordinarily perceptive in one specific sensory domain. However, I must note that her ability, if known publicly, could be misinterpreted as evidence against theories of Negro inferiority. For the preservation of social order, I recommend that this case not be published or discussed beyond necessary parties." Dr. Hayes' recommendation was followed. His report was filed away, marked confidential, but the fact of his examination became known among the enslaved community at Riverside, and Mary's status changed. She was no longer just a curiosity or an inspiration. She was now a documented anomaly, examined by white authorities, classified as both remarkable and dangerous. The winter of 1861-1862 was harsh. The war was going badly for Virginia. Union forces were advancing, resources were scarce, and on the plantation tensions were high. James Cunningham, worried about maintaining control, instituted stricter rules. No gatherings without permission, increased surveillance, harsher punishments for infractions. And Mary, despite her isolation, remained a focal point of attention. In January 1862, something happened that brought Mary's story to a wider audience. A Union cavalry raid passed near Riverside. Several enslaved people used the chaos to escape. Among them was a young man who had been close to Mary, someone who had helped her navigate the plantation when she was younger. His name was Samuel. He made it to Union lines and eventually to Washington, D.C., where he was interviewed by members of the American Freedmen's Inquiry Commission, a government body investigating the conditions of enslaved people to inform emancipation policy. Samuel told them about Mary. His testimony, recorded in the Commission's files at the National Archives, described her as a girl who could read with her hands, though she had no eyes that worked. He explained that she had taught herself, that she could read any book you gave her, and that white people on the plantation were afraid of what she represented. His testimony was brief, just one paragraph in a much longer interview, but it caught the attention of a commission member named James McKay, who made a note in the margin: "Investigate this claim. If true, significant implications for education policy." But before any investigation could occur, the situation at Riverside reached a crisis point. In February 1862, the overseer, William Garrett, wrote the letter to Dr. Hayes that opened this story. Garrett was concerned that Mary's abilities, combined with the escapes and the general unrest, were destabilizing the plantation. He reported that enslaved people were asking Mary to teach them to read, believing that if she could learn without sight, they could learn despite the prohibition. He reported that some were calling her a prophet, claiming she had special knowledge. And he reported that James Cunningham was increasingly agitated and wanted medical confirmation that Mary should be removed from the plantation for everyone's safety. Dr. Hayes returned to Riverside in March 1862. This time, his examination was not just of Mary, but of the situation as a whole. He interviewed enslaved people, spoke with the overseer, and assessed what he called the psychological impact of the girl's presence. His report, dated March 15, 1862, was more explicit than his previous one. He wrote, "The blind girl continues to exhibit her unusual reading ability. However, the greater concern is the effect she has on others. She has become a symbol of resistance, a living refutation of the claims used to justify the institution of slavery. Her very existence suggests that Negroes possess capabilities we have denied. This is creating hope where we need compliance, questions where we need obedience. I recommend that she be removed from the plantation and placed in an asylum for the blind, where her abilities can be contained and studied without causing social disruption." The recommendation to send Mary to an asylum was implemented swiftly. In April 1862, she was taken from Riverside to the Virginia Institution for the Education of the Deaf and Dumb and the Blind in Staunton, Virginia. The institution, founded in 1839, was one of the first schools for disabled children in the South. But it was segregated, white students only. Mary, being black and enslaved, should not have been admitted. However, Dr. Hayes had connections with the institution's superintendent, and he arranged for Mary to be admitted under special circumstances. She was not to be a student, but a subject of study, confined to a separate building, examined by visiting physicians and educators. The records from the Virginia Institution, preserved in the Library of Virginia, show that Mary remained there for 7 months, from April to November 1862. During that time, she was examined by numerous professionals. Each confirmed her ability to read by touch, each struggled to explain it, and each concluded that her existence posed a challenge to prevailing assumptions about race and disability. One particularly detailed account comes from Dr. Elizabeth Garrett, a rare female physician who visited the institution in June 1862. Dr. Garrett's notes, discovered among her papers at the University of Virginia in 1989, described Mary as intelligent, articulate, and remarkably calm, given her circumstances. Dr. Garrett conducted extensive tests, not just of Mary's reading ability, but of her overall cognitive function. She concluded, "This girl possesses an intellect that would be considered exceptional in any context. She is not simply perceiving letters by touch. She is comprehending complex texts, retaining information, and demonstrating reasoning abilities that suggest significant untapped potential. The tragedy is not that she is blind, but that she is enslaved and will never be given the opportunity to develop her gifts. Dr. Garrett's assessment was unusual for its empathy and its explicit criticism of slavery, but it was also filed away, unpublished, unshared, because as Dr. Hayes had warned, Mary's story, if widely known, would have dangerous implications. Those implications became apparent in the fall of 1862. The war was escalating. President Lincoln had issued a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation in September, declaring that enslaved people in Confederate states would be freed as of January 1st, 1863. The Confederacy rejected this decree, but its announcement electrified enslaved communities across the South. Rumors of freedom spread. Resistance increased. And in this atmosphere, stories like Mary's, stories of impossible achievement of hidden capabilities, took on new resonance. The superintendent of the Virginia institution, Dr. John Waller, became concerned that Mary's presence was attracting too much attention. Visitors to the institution were asking to see her. Word had spread among educators and physicians that there was a blind Negro girl who could read standard print by touch. Some wanted to study her. Others wanted to prove she was a fraud. And a few, abolitionists or sympathizers, wanted to use her as evidence against slavery. Dr. Waller decided that Mary needed to be removed. In November 1862, he wrote to James Cunningham, informing him that Mary was being returned to Riverside. The letter, preserved in the Cunningham family papers, stated, "While the girl's abilities are genuine and medically fascinating, her presence here has become problematic. She attracts too much curiosity, and in the current political climate, any case that suggests Negro intellectual capacity is being weaponized by abolitionists. For the institution's reputation and safety, she must be returned to your custody." Mary was sent back to Riverside in late November 1862, but the plantation she returned to had changed. The war had intensified. Union forces were closer. More enslaved people had escaped. And James Cunningham, now elderly and in declining health, had lost much of his authority. The overseer, William Garrett, effectively ran the plantation, and he viewed Mary with open hostility. What happened next is documented through multiple sources that create a disturbing picture. In December 1862, Mary disappeared from the plantation records. No death was recorded, no sale was noted. She simply vanished from the documentation. For over a century, her fate was unknown. Then in 1968, a historian researching Civil War-era medical records discovered a patient log from a private sanitarium in Lynchburg, Virginia. The sanitarium, which no longer exists, had specialized in treating nervous disorders and mental afflictions. The log, dated December 1862 through February 1863, included an entry for a patient identified only as colored girl, blind, approximately 14 years, admitted at the request of W. Garrett Eskin, diagnosis, delusions and hysteria. The description matched Mary, the timing matched, and the diagnosis, delusions and hysteria, was a common way to pathologize behavior that challenged social norms. Mary, who could read by touch and had become a symbol of enslaved people's potential, had been declared insane and institutionalized. The sanitarium records show that Mary remained there for 3 months. The treatment she received is not detailed, but medical practices of the period for hysteria typically included isolation, sedation, and various physical therapies designed to calm the patient. These treatments were often harmful, especially in institutions that served black patients, where abuse was common and oversight was minimal. In March 1863, the records indicate that Mary died. The cause of death was listed as consumption, tuberculosis. This was a common cause of death in 19th-century institutions, where overcrowding, poor sanitation, and inadequate nutrition created ideal conditions for disease. Mary was buried in an unmarked grave in the sanitarium cemetery, along with other patients who died there. The news of her death never reached the enslaved community at Riverside. They were told she had been sold to a distant plantation, a common lie used to explain the disappearance of enslaved people. It was not until decades later, when Samuel, the man who had escaped and testified about Mary, was interviewed again in 1898 by a researcher studying post-emancipation communities, that he asked what had happened to her. By then, the trail was cold, the witnesses were dead, and the truth seemed unrecoverable. But Samuel's question prompted the researcher, a woman named Clara Morrison, to begin investigating. Morrison was a teacher at Hampton Institute, a black college in Virginia, and she was interested in documenting the intellectual achievements of formerly enslaved people. She tracked down former residents of Riverside, interviewed them, and slowly pieced together Mary's story. She found James Cunningham's journals. She found Dr. Hayes's reports. She found the Virginia Institution records. And eventually, in 1903, she found the sanitarium log. Morrison published her findings in 1904 in a small academic journal called The Southern Workman, which was affiliated with Hampton Institute. Her article, titled "The Blind Reader, A Case of Suppressed Genius in Antebellum Virginia," presented Mary's story as evidence of how slavery had destroyed black potential. She argued that Mary represented countless others whose abilities had been hidden, denied, or eliminated because they challenged the racial hierarchy. The article received almost no attention. It was published in a journal with limited circulation, read primarily by black educators and white philanthropists interested in black education. Mainstream academic journals ignored it. Popular magazines didn't mention it. The story of Mary, the blind girl who could read by touch, remained obscure. It was not until the 1950s and 1960s, during the civil rights movement, that Mary's story was rediscovered. Historians searching for examples of black intellectual achievement in the antebellum period found Morrison's article and began investigating further. They confirmed her findings, located additional documents, and established that Mary's story was not legend but documented fact. In 1958, a medical historian named Dr. Philip Reeves examined Mary's case from a scientific perspective. He consulted with experts in tactile perception and blindness to determine whether Mary's ability was medically plausible. The consensus was that yes, it was possible, though extremely rare. Some individuals with blindness do develop extraordinarily refined tactile discrimination. With standard printing, the pressure of metal type into paper creates microscopic variations that a highly sensitive touch might detect. Additionally, ink creates subtle texture differences that could potentially be perceived. Most people cannot detect these variations, but someone with exceptional tactile sensitivity, trained through years of practice, might be able to. Dr. Reeves concluded, Mary's ability, while extraordinary, was likely within the realm of natural human capability pushed to its extreme limit. She was not performing a miracle, but demonstrating what human neuroplasticity can achieve when necessity demands it and opportunity allows. The real tragedy is not that her ability is difficult to explain, but that it was treated as threatening rather than remarkable. But even as the scientific explanation was accepted, questions remained. How did Mary first discover she could feel letters? What motivated her to spend years practicing this skill in secret? And what intellectual achievements might she have accomplished if she had been allowed to develop her abilities rather than being suppressed and ultimately killed? These questions cannot be fully answered. Mary left no written records of her own. She could read, but, as far as we know, she never learned to write, since Braille had not yet been developed, and standard writing would have been impossible for her to produce. Her voice comes to us only through the observations of others, through the reports of doctors and plantation owners and ministers who documented her abilities while simultaneously working to contain them. What we do know is that Mary's story follows a pattern seen repeatedly in the history of slavery and racism. Exceptional individuals who demonstrated abilities that contradicted racist ideology were not celebrated, but suppressed. Their achievements were minimized, explained away, or, when they could not be denied, treated as aberrations or threats. The system could not accommodate evidence of black intellectual capacity because such evidence undermined the entire justification for racial hierarchy. Mary understood this, according to one of the few direct quotes attributed to her. In Dr. Elizabeth Garrett's notes from June 1862, there is a brief record of a conversation. Dr. Garrett had asked Mary if she understood why she had been sent to the institution. Mary reportedly replied, "They are afraid of what I can do, not because it harms them, but because it proves them wrong. I'm not supposed to be able to read. Blind people are not supposed to be able to read. Colored people are not supposed to be able to read. I am both, and I can read. So they must make me disappear." This clarity, this understanding of the forces arrayed against her, is perhaps more remarkable than her reading ability. Mary was 14 years old, blind, enslaved, and facing powers that could destroy her with impunity. Yet she understood the stakes. She knew that her existence was political, that her abilities were evidence in a debate she had not chosen to enter, and that the outcome of that debate would determine not just her fate, but the fate of millions. In the end, Mary was made to disappear. She died in an institution, buried in an unmarked grave, her name erased from official records. For over a century, her story was unknown to the general public. And even after it was rediscovered, it remained marginal, a footnote in histories of slavery, a curiosity in medical journals, a cautionary tale in discussions of disability rights. But Mary's story persists because it represents something that cannot be fully erased, evidence of human potential in the face of systemic oppression. She taught herself to read, blind and enslaved, using only her fingers and her determination. She demonstrated abilities that educated men could not explain, and she was destroyed for it, not by accident, not by neglect, but by deliberate decision. People in power looked at her, recognized what she represented, and chose to eliminate that representation rather than question their assumptions. This is the most disturbing aspect of Mary's story. It was not that her abilities were doubted. They were extensively documented and verified. It was that once verified, they had to be hidden. The truth about Mary was too dangerous to acknowledge. It would have raised uncomfortable questions about all the other enslaved people whose potential had been denied, about all the laws prohibiting black education, about all the theories justifying racial hierarchy. One blind girl who could read by touch was sufficient evidence to challenge an entire ideology, and so she was silenced. The parallels between Mary's blindness and her society's blindness are impossible to ignore. She, despite lacking physical sight, perceived what others could not. She saw, through touch, through intellect, through insight, truths that sighted people refused to acknowledge. The white men who examined her, documented her abilities, and then recommended her suppression were the truly blind ones. They could not see past their prejudices. They could not perceive the humanity in front of them. They chose ideology over evidence, maintaining comfortable lies rather than accepting uncomfortable truths. In recent years, Mary's story has been taught in some universities and used in discussions about intersectionality, the way multiple forms of oppression overlap and compound. Mary faced discrimination based on race, gender, disability, and class. She should have been invisible, voiceless, powerless, and yet she achieved something extraordinary. Her story forces us to consider how many other people, facing similar or different forms of oppression, have possessed abilities the world never recognized. In 2012, a memorial was proposed for Mary in Henrico County, Virginia, near the site of the former Riverside Plantation. The proposal faced opposition from some community members who questioned whether Mary's story was proven enough to warrant a memorial and whether focusing on one individual's suffering was appropriate. After years of debate, a compromise was reached. In 2018, a historical marker was placed near the site, reading, "In memory of Mary, an enslaved girl who taught herself to read despite blindness, whose achievements were documented by multiple witnesses, and whose life was ended by a system that feared what she represented. Her story honors all whose potential was destroyed by oppression." The marker does not claim to explain how Mary read by touch. It does not romanticize her suffering. It simply acknowledges that she existed, that she achieved something remarkable, and that she was destroyed for it. This acknowledgement, while modest, is significant. It is a refusal to let the erasure be complete. There is no known image of Mary, no photograph, no sketch, no physical description beyond the basic facts recorded in medical reports. We do not know what she looked like. We know only what she could do and what was done to her. This absence is itself telling. Mary was documented extensively by those who studied her. Her abilities were measured, tested, verified, but she herself was never seen as worthy of portrayal. She was a subject of examination, not a person deserving of commemoration. But perhaps this absence creates space for a different kind of remembering. Without an image to fix her in time and place, Mary becomes representative. She stands for all the blind people who developed remarkable abilities and were never recognized. She stands for all the enslaved people who educated themselves against impossible odds. She stands for all the girls and women whose intelligence was treated as threatening rather than valuable. She becomes not just an individual, but a symbol, though not the kind of symbol Reverend Whitfield feared. Not a symbol of resistance or rebellion, but a symbol of persistent human potential, of the ineradicable drive to learn and grow and achieve even in the most hostile circumstances. The question of whether Mary's tactile reading ability was unique or whether others possessed similar capabilities remains open. Medical literature from the 19th century contains scattered references to blind individuals with extraordinary tactile discrimination. Some could identify playing cards by touch, feeling the minute variations in ink. Some could distinguish between fabrics with remarkable precision. A few, like Mary, claimed to read standard print, but these cases were rarely studied systematically, and even more rarely were they taken seriously. In the 20th century, with the development of Braille and other tactile reading systems, the need for such extreme tactile sensitivity decreased. Blind people could learn to read through standardized systems designed for touch. Mary's method, feeling the microscopic depressions and texture variations in standard print, became unnecessary. But the fact that she developed this method independently, without guidance or encouragement, without even knowing it was possible, speaks to human ingenuity and determination. If Mary had been born into different circumstances, if she had been white, free, male, wealthy, her abilities would likely have been celebrated. She might have been studied by scientists, written about in journals, brought to universities as a demonstration of human potential. She might have been given opportunities to develop her abilities further, to contribute to understanding of sensory perception and neural plasticity. She might have lived a long life, recognized and respected. Instead, she was born black, enslaved, female and blind, and so her abilities, rather than being celebrated, had to be contained. She was examined in secret, hidden away, and ultimately eliminated. Her story was suppressed for a century, and even now, when it is finally known, it remains marginal, a historical curiosity rather than a central narrative in American history. But perhaps that is changing. As we become more aware of how history has been written, whose stories have been told and whose have been erased. Cases like Mary's take on new significance. They are not just individual tragedies, but evidence of systematic suppression. They reveal how power structures maintain themselves by controlling narratives, by determining whose achievements count and whose do not, by making certain people and their accomplishments invisible. Mary could not be made to not exist. She lived, she learned, she read. But she could be, and was, made to not matter. Her life was deemed insignificant. Her death was unmarked. Her story was buried. And for over 100 years it worked. She was forgotten. But memory is persistent. Stories, once documented, can be recovered. Truth, once recorded, can be rediscovered. Mary's story survived because a few people, Samuel, who testified about her, Clara Morrison, who investigated, Dr. Reeves, who analyzed, refused to let it disappear completely. Each of them, across decades, contributed to preserving the record. And now that record exists, incomplete but undeniable. This is Mary's legacy. Not what she might have accomplished if given the chance, but the mere fact that her story survived. In a system designed to erase her, she is remembered. In a society that tried to make her not matter, her story matters. And in a history that has systematically excluded black voices, her voice, mediated through the documents of those who studied her, can still be heard. The blind girl who learned to read in the dark, who developed abilities that defied explanation, who was examined, documented, feared and destroyed, who should have been forgotten but wasn't, whose story, once buried, has been brought back into light. If this story moved you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Share your thoughts in the comments. And remember, every erased story that gets recovered is a victory against the forces that tried to silence it.